So, opening with Prohim. Well, this acts as a brief, ominous introduction. A melody of pure mourning, emanating from the faintest of frequencies and oddest of distortions and disturbances. A sense of lo-fi occupying the scene before we're enveloped in these gradually growing drones. And from it all, the confusing sounds of the world all around us, the movement of people, vehicles, all unaware of the terrible ordeal that is trying to be understood through the music itself. An incredibly brief yet an impactful opening track that perfectly sets the scene for what's going to be an incredibly melancholy and dark album experience. That sense of confusion and disorientation as you try to collect your thoughts only for it to be thrown into this bleak level of uncertainty. Quandil Matouche. From here, it all navigates towards the album itself, this collection of experimental ambient sketches. This next track fades into the scene slowly, this faint melody of high frequencies caught in these very unusual and uncomfortable effects. There's a bed of ambience, captured by the unusual performances from the various instruments utilised across the entire album, and it results in something that feels so distinctly melancholy, just the contemplation of the very confusing thoughts that your mind tries to attach any reason or understanding to, despite it being so incomprehensible. And though it feels like it cannot be truly understood, it still just occurs as always, just drifting past, like the very passages of time itself. This opener of sorts feels wistful, like staring out those train windows as your mind gets lost and adrift as the world rushes past, before the composition just descends into this murky bed of lo-fi ambient drones, as you find yourself just going over and over the darkness and the terror that has been experienced here. There is such an emotional weight that carries itself with the composition, in all of the compositions in fact. The tracks themselves seemingly morphing and changing with the very passage of time itself, carrying you through this gamut of emotions. For myself, I find the experience to be so incredibly existential, one that when I first heard it many years ago felt so cold and impenetrable, the particulars of the music itself feeling just so uncomfortable and disturbing, cold and isolated. But it makes sense in the context of the album itself, of the story being expressed here by James McDermid. His own contemplation and understanding of his experience being fueled to this very album that we are listening to. Our next track, Fais la Tombe. This one kind of opens up with an unusual ambient drone, feeling like some old memory stretched out with unusual effects until it becomes this wave of sound that envelopes us. There's a quite airy, empty sentiment accompanying it, before you get that unusual melody of sorts attempting to come through the storm, sounding distorted and reversed in these very brief instances before somehow they manage to take over the scene entirely. And it starts to become oddly terrifying, especially when you get this almost percussive element just thumping in place at such a terrifying tempo, setting our own pulses racing against this bed of ambient drone and noises that just continues to grow and grow to these very tumultuous levels. Once again, it feels like being in motion, being carried along by vehicles as you comprehend such disturbances. You forced to only just stare out the window and let your mind cloud with this collection of thoughts and memories and that you don't want to remember. Like the world is just seemingly to continue to follow that flow of time, even when your own thoughts have grinded everything to a complete halt. It is an odd track that feels ominous and creepy in context of everything. The mind wandering and conjuring very spectres from your memory that form terrifying existential visions. The normalcy of everything contrasted with the disturbing contemplation the mind is going through. It's odd in that it feels fascinating, though, as for myself, I find myself in awe of the very experience, as it's one that perfectly pulls you into that incredibly dark, melancholy landscape as it pushes it all along, though it's still so impenetrable, so icy and so cold and so clinical almost. It's hard to really tap into it. But when you allow the emotion of the music to just pour through you, it becomes one of the most powerful experiences in music, I think. Our next track of Tonde, this one opts for an unusual sound palette, utilising field recordings in a fascinating way as we get murky drones occupying the scene. It even sounds like the rain itself is just falling all around us as cars drive past as we listen to this sparse and sad tune. And I'm not sure why, but I feel like this one is perhaps amongst the more impenetrable tracks on the album. One that loops elements over and over as it just grows and grows this bed of confusing noises. Like the darkness really seeps in on this one, as it just slowly starts to grow and grow and become more incomprehensible the more it all occurs. Like there's an abstraction at work here, an interpretation of the very feelings McDermid is experiencing, being expressed to us in the form of a rather tumultuous composition, utilising ambient notions in this rather horrific and terrifying way, to be truth be told. But even with the rather disturbing elements we're being presented with it, there is still something powerful about it. This sense of trying to navigate these experiences through the composition of instrumental music. It means all we as listeners can rely on is the feelings and emotions that we as listeners experience when hearing this particular album. And the fact that it manages to capture such powerful emotions makes it so incredible to listen to, in spite of its incredibly dark nature. It's fascinating how, so many of the songs, they seem to start off rather subtly and minimally, before they fall into the recesses of just chaos and discordance, the incomprehensible nature of it all being expressed in the form of tumultuous music that is ebbing and flowing, and our awareness of it all just being played around with by the very music itself, forcing us on a similar journey as a result. Weirdly fascinating to me, and it's always been something that has just held me right here when I first listened to this so many years ago, and even when I still listen to it this day, it still just gets to me in such a difficult way to describe. Our next track, El était un harde de combattant, we start to hear the guitar coming through a bit, more clearly in amongst that bed of field recordings, and the unusual clicking of some sort, maybe like a clock of some kind perhaps? And from there it all seems to slowly grow once more, incorporating more instruments here and there, adding to the dark and foreboding soundscape. And it creates a very tense opener. One that seems like another difficult navigation, another wandering of the mind into places and memories as the journey continues along. Very odd, but I do wonder if any of this was perhaps inspired by journeys that McDermid was taking at the time of recording this very album. The daily commutes back and forth from work perhaps, or to wherever they needed to go. It's been coming up a lot in the recent reviews, so I do apologise for the constant comparison to commuting and train journeys and stuff. But listening to the music does often give me that sense of motion, especially with how some of the field recordings sound on this one, like the sounding like the movement of carriages, the noisy sound of a world that continuing to go past, even though your mind is just in complete turmoil. I don't know if it's intentional, or if it is just how I'm interpreting the album while I'm listening to it on my own commute, but I do find it hard not to make the parallel when I hear it, of course. It is something that has always come to mind to me whenever hearing this particular album, the use of field recordings to anchor it all into a reality whilst the instrumentals carry it all into abstraction, letting the mind wander far and wide as you start to pore over the many memories you have of your own. And although I cannot begin to truly understand the harrowing experience McDermid was going through, trying to contemplate and understand on this album, I do feel carried by the very musical journey though, and it is one that has me considering the very existential nature of life itself, of existence, of death, of the world, and how it all just pushes past with no real regard for our own individual experiences. But then again, why would it? But Regardless, it is without a doubt one of the more fascinating tracks here, another perfect existential musing in the form of this abstract instrumental performance that continues this very tragic, harrowing journey. Our next track of Phantom, this one opens up with a distorted twanging of some kind of instrument perhaps. Maybe I want to say like a ukulele perhaps, caught in a delusion of effects, resonating with delays and echoes as it fills the space with this very unusual sound. And it seems to just rattle and resonate around a very spectrum of hearing, especially when you get these large descents of singular low-end notes, with it slowly incorporating some more subtle ambient drones the more it all occurs. This one feels oddly minimalist, accompanied by these very unusual effects coming in and out, almost barely existing in amongst the composition, with it perhaps being a representation of a glimpse of the very spectre haunting McDermid's mind. Something terrifying and existential and yet oddly familiar sounding. Like, for me, it feels like one of the few actual musical moments on the album, like something that sounds like an instrument, and yet it's still shrouded in this sort of veil of disturbances, if that makes any sense. And as a track, it acts like a rather brief interlude, but oddly enough, I find it a little less dark and foreboding than some of the previous tracks. Weirdly enough though, especially with all the distortion effects that accompany the instrument, this does slowly transition to a subtle ambient drones, and it does feel a little bit more towards the end like a form of contemplation, of coming to some understanding and attempting to move on from something that's difficult to wrap one's head around. And as a result, the tone does feel a little bit lighter, as though there's maybe some glimpse of hope to be found in these incredible troublesome times. Or maybe even the fact that when we try to understand these experiences, Some days are better than others. Our next track, Ballad Lependus. This one slowly opens up with lo-fi static and effects as we once again find ourselves quickly occupying that sense of motion once more. It comes across in how the particulars of the songs, express themselves on this one. The particular of or the instrumentals here, you get that sense of motion and moving once again. And behind it all, you have this growing bed of ambient drones and layers, all occupying the scene, pulling into abstraction once more. And it feels, once again, a little bit lighter, than some of the previous scenes, perhaps. Easier to wrap one's head around, as though the dark, disturbing nature of these memories themselves are finally now start to become a little bit easier to manage, as though we have a sense of healing that's now being found now that enough time has passed, maybe. But it is still a very strange composition, though. For opting for some odd frequencies and unusual passages of wind and air, that sort of combine in amongst those more droning instrumental layers. And once again, those moments where the mind just wanders far and wide whilst the world continues to rush past, is another sort of moment in the story of this album of, perhaps finally finding a sense of understanding in amongst the incomprehensible. And I once again find that fascinating, the strange navigation this album opts for when heard in this singular setting, opting for such harrowing darkness before navigating towards a quiet acceptance of everything. It's almost as though the wounds haven't healed yet, and probably will never truly fully heal, but they will slowly become easier to manage the more time passes. And finding ourselves as part of this album, it does start to get a little bit easier for us, even as listeners experience this very harrowing experience, that is to say. It should be said, it's not without its elements of tension, though, even with these tracks, especially towards the end of this one, in amongst the gentle static, there is a persistent thump of electronics and a beat being established, like the pounding of the heart as the lights flash past the windows. That ebb and pull effect being represented to us, perhaps showing us a sense of fear and acceptance, perhaps, and contrasting the two. So our next track, Il ne ta monte quella l'ombre, this one opens up with an unusual deluge of delay effects, it feels. Odd frequencies caught in amongst these odd effects before being accompanied by the faint murmuring of voices, it feels. The whispers and spectres of ghosts, itself then accompanied by unusual reversed effects that throw us back to a sense of confusion once more. And so I find after all that talk of things getting easier to comprehend and manage, we now find ourselves thrown back into the comprehensible once more. That even though we get certain times when things feel easier to manage, we still find ourselves navigating passages where it once again becomes all too much to bear. And where the darkness and disturbing, harrowing nature once again clouds our mind, and with how this one opts for such an unusual tapestry of unusual effects and echoing voices, it seems to fall right back into the more macabre and disturbing nature of the compositions. Like, it amazes me, because I'm not sure how intentional it all is, but it does feel oddly intentional. Like, once again, just falling back into this growing cloud of disturbances while the spectral ghostly voices just cloud our very mind, with us just wanting to hide away from it all, but unable to stop the growing cloud of thoughts that come through. And the more this one all occurs, the more dark and disturbing it all feels, especially towards the end when you experience this loop of very unusual cloudy static that occurs over and over and over, like the memory of the darkest experience being replayed over and over again, constantly in a matter of seconds. It feels so dark and disturbing to me, yet a fascinating part of the very journey this album is taking us on, the part of healing and understanding against the tumultuous nature of navigating the turmoil of emotions. Like, you find your mind just travelling back to those memories that feel so painful, re-experiencing all of that turmoil and chaos once more, as the music becomes more and more of just a sonic overloading storm. And that although we find certain times when things are easier, they are contrasted by the continuing moments that are dark and foreboding as they always have had been. Like, that fascinates me, the navigation that this album takes us on. And this track being situated right here, rather than on the first half, acting more as a return to that dark foreboding nature of it all, it just creates such a wonderful contrast of when things sometimes feel like they get better, your mind pulls you back into that trauma once more. It's amazing, and I feel like it is perhaps one of the most powerful statements on this album. So we then move to La Mort du Sol Innocent. And so after everything we have experienced, we find ourselves with the longest song on this album. 15 minutes to contemplate everything we have just gone through in the form of slowing, growing ambient drones. So this, for me, this feels like what the album has slowly been building up towards. This is what I wanted to talk about most when it came to this particular analysis of sort, I guess, which is perhaps why I formatted this one in a very weird way. As you can know, we have foregone the traditional opening that we normally go and just gone straight into it. But I feel like we need to with this album. With this being such a long track though, this is where we're going to explain everything and get our answers though. So to talk about the track itself first though, the track opens up with a growing bed of subtle ambient drones. One that feels completely untethered in time and space as we just find our mind wandering around and contemplating it all. And what I adore is the sound palette on this one. A kind of subtle melody in the background provided by the keyboards or something like that. You know, the growing emergence of droning effects sourced from other instruments, perhaps maybe affected by post-processing perhaps. Hard to know, but whatever it is, it just becomes such a sad, mournful eulogy that ebbs and flows with those gentle drones and these higher-pitched moments of glory that feels like the sun finally breaking through the sky. And it all then just drifts by like this for 15 minutes, growing in volume and density with such an incredibly slow and subtle shift. A truly phenomenal experience of this album, something that has taken us such a long time to build up towards, but one that's so incredibly rewarding as a result. And it gives us so much time to just sit with ourselves, contemplate our thoughts, and understand what we get from it, if that makes sense, or what we come to our own understanding. A gentle soundscape that to me feels like a far cry away from the rather disturbing nature of the previous tracks, and instead feels like an establishing of peace during the turmoil we have experienced. And even when you get the more introduction of other elements, you know, the clashing calamity of field recordings perhaps, it still occupies that beautifully gentle, serene scene, creating this beautiful moment of contemplation. It's such a careful and rather considerate navigation of a very strange and harrowing world that we've been journeying through, culminating here in this moment of existential bliss. So, it's unusual and yet fascinating me, but what is going on here? Why have I been so cagey in this video? Well, I'm actually not sure why, but it's just how this one's all come together, and I thought it was interesting to present something with a different format though. So, I think it is here that we may as well go through the notes on Bandcamp and let you know what's really going on here. Once again, kind of like in the same vein as when we reviewed Jubilee by Robert Takahashi Crouch, it's here we get a lot of context for what we have been experiencing, and it's why I didn't want to mention anything concrete while talking about all of the songs. I wanted to save it after we talked about everything and when we had time to talk about it during this particular track. James A. McDermid is a Bristol, UK-based artist who has spent some time in Portugal. He became inspired to write music under the names Like Kisses of Thread after discovering artists such as Philip Jack, Janet Schaefer, Christian McCarley, and Keith Matthews, a project which ran alongside the curation of his label Nasty Candy, which even piqued the interest of a certain John Peel, who played a piece on his Radio 1 show. The label ceased operation in 2005 due to work commitments and the rigours of running the demands of a job and a label simultaneously. James stopped writing and recording music in 2010. This was until the sudden tragedy of his sister Harriet being diagnosed as terminally ill threw his world upside down. Struggling to understand the gravity of it all, or know what to do to help, he turned to music once more. In fact, the music poured out of him to the extent that he decided to create a trilogy of albums all dedicated to the memory of Harriet. The initial record, Ghost Folk, made up of 25 tracks, was released on Polar Seas in 2017. And earlier this year, Chrysalis Sound released a follow-up, Tonal Glints. The triptych is now complete with the final piece, which is Kern-Host. Ghost Folk represents his sister's diagnosis and working condition. Tonal Glint represents her death and the immediate aftermath, while Kern-Host embodies closure. In the 3 albums, James tried to focus on melody and structured each track around it. Not all of the tracks worked out this way, but working through his grief seemed to lend itself to finding melodies. Kern-Host began as James spent time alone in Paris. He'd walk around the city during the day and then work on music at night in his hotel room. He'd sift and rework sounds he captured at home. He has a piano, a couple of accordions, a violin, guitar and a ukulele. Using his laptop, headphones and a tiny keyboard controller, he is able to work in a location away from the environment that his sample library had been created, and Paris became the backdrop to this project. The 10 recordings, aptly titled in French, feel as if James has recorded a sonic diary of his time spent alone in Paris, and the beautiful textures to these drones will help you feel a part of his solitary visit. The accompanying cover artwork is of arranged dried flowers against a plain background. Of the trilogy, this is the first cover that is in colour to represent the themes of closure that are present in Kern-Host. Released November 18th, 2018, for My Sister Harriet, 1975 to 2016. Written and produced by James A. McDermid. Written in Paris, Bristol and the Algarve. Mastered by Tim Diagram. Artwork by James McDermid. Thanks to Inez, Harry, Brad, Francis, Paul, Tom, Susie, Al. So, very heavy stuff, of course. I am genuinely a little bit disturbed by it all. And I feel like I maybe should have left well enough alone and not discuss this album. But at the same time, this is an album that has really resonated to me when I first heard it, though, ever since I first heard it. And I've always wanted, feel like a need to try talk about the albums that resonate with me, because discussing things that capture existentialism in me is something I think is worth doing, even if it doesn't make sense to everyone. Funnily enough, this was actually an album I first mentioned all the way back in the Homes for Drones video, which was the very start of the video was discussing that album. It's a very weird way to have started up that list, and it actually makes very little sense when I go back to think about it. But then again, at the time, it was an album that really captured my fascination, and so then hence it got included. And having heard it so much to this very day, this is an album I actually see in the very same ilk as the likes of The Caretakers Everywhere at the End of Time, or even The Infected Mass by Those Who Walk Away, which is perhaps one of the most harrowing albums I've ever heard. These instrumental album experiences that utilize a lot of elements for ambient sound exploration to create these resonating cathartic experiences. And this one is so wholly personal though, hence that icy impenetrable wall the whole experience seems to put up. Much like Mount Erie's A Crow Looked at Me, is the process of navigating grief through musical compositions. A lot of it I don't really know if I can put into words either. How do you even talk about grief properly? I don't know. I don't think there is a correct way to do these things. And it's more the process of doing these things that is important, as opposed to the end result sometimes. I will try my best to summarise though. As mentioned, the central core of this album is the closure of McDermid's experience of expressing the tragedy of his sister's death. And so this triptych of albums started with the 2017 release of Ghost Folk, an album that saw McDermid returning to music after a long period of inactivity, using the notion of composition to help navigate the turmoil of his sister's diagnosis and worsening condition. To then follow it up with Tonal Glints, the second album the triptych dealt with his sister's tragic death. I don't think much more needs to be said about it. But here on Kern-Host, we have McDermid handling closure, of finally sealing this all away in the form of one final exploration of all of those feelings and experiences. And yeah, I'm reminded so much of the likes of Mount Erie's A Crow Looked at Me, of how both artists have utilised the creation and composition of music, not as a way of exploiting the respective deaths of their loved ones, but rather as a catalyst to navigate their experience of trying to comprehend and understand what they are currently experiencing. Like, we see this in art, and it's incredibly hard for us as listeners to actually wrap our heads around it all. Like, why would you want to create music that expresses such terrible experiences in your life? I truly believe, though, when it comes to people using music to manage these experiences, it's not about the end result. It's not really about the finished albums that we as listeners can hear it. To the composers, it's that process itself. Not so much about the finished piece of art, but the process of creating that art that is driving them, as it becomes a way to abstractly express the incomprehensible, what truly cannot be understood. And for McDermid, this was a return to making music, purely as a form of navigating and understanding the incredibly difficult, harrowing experience that he was going through. Like, when you pour so much of what you are creating, so much of yourself into what you're creating, you end up oftentimes than not, creating something truly powerful, especially when the state of mind you're inhabiting gets poured into all the music as well. This is something our lead singer Chad does a lot when writing the lyrics for the songs in Burdened Limbs, of course. This is one of the reasons why I was so drawn to become a part of that project, actually. But to go back to McDermid, though, I feel the experience of it is besides the point, and it's perhaps irrelevant, though, because what matters most is the process of McDermid managing his grief by composing music. And maybe it's because of how my brain is wired. I find the experience to be incredibly impactful, something that the empathetic part of me just resonates with, even though I personally cannot ever understand the true level of grief that is being experienced here. I can only go by the music itself, which seems to have had James's whole heart and soul poured into it, with every emotion alongside with it. Incredibly strange and unusual, but as mentioned, truly powerful and impactful, and the kind of thing that will maybe resonate with some of you watching this show. Like many of us, know grief, I'm sure, and anything that helps the understanding and processing of grief is important, even if it's the making of artistic expressions. Like in the case of things like this, it's truly brutal, but of course it's going to be right. But then so is the experience of going through the experience itself, so is existing through that. And if making something like this can help guide us through these strange, inexplicable experiences, then it's important. And how we all manage and handle grief, it's different to everybody. For some of us, it's the making of things. For some of us, it is the experience of listening to things like this. For me, I can understand the importance of it all. Creating something like this, it's something dark, but incredibly cathartic. So we actually have one final track, Mettre Fin. End. A true closer for this entire experience. Weird for me to make closing remarks before the album has even finished, but it felt fitting to make my comments over the previous track as mentioned. But here we do get one final descent into a strange ambient soundscape. This feels like a recollection of some of the themes heard on the interlude track of Phantom, as though the ghost continues to exist long after we've come to terms with everything, imprinted in our very being in the form of this spectral audio. It is a very strange track, as I feel so many of its details kind of just drift past like a small churning miasma of uncertainty, but one that feels strangely familiar, one that we're simply used to and have come to expect maybe by this point. And it's strange that it feels like we're being pulled right back into reality itself though, after becoming completely untethered in the previous track. This one kind of pulls us right back to the centre of it all, back to the daily grind, as our mind just continues to cloud over thoughts and memories that continue to persist. For me, it is a chilling closer. Ending it all on this very bleak and gloomy prospect that weirdly enough makes sense to me though. Like even after you come to terms with everything that's happened, you still have to push along, now haunted by the very spectres in our mind. Strange, but feels very fitting placing it here at the end of everything. One final moment of confusion perhaps. So I genuinely don't know what else to say about this one. I feel like I've said all I wanted to, and there's nothing much else for me to do except wrap things up and, prepare myself for the next harrowing album experience, I guess, when we get to it. It's strange because I don't know why I respond so much to this kind of music, but especially when it's been born from something so personal, I can't help but be in awe of the very experience. A cathartic rubbing of salt on the wound, perhaps. For me, it's the kind of thing that speaks for itself. In getting to this point in writing of this review, and presenting it and stuff, I realised how kind of all redundant this is. You know, my experience of this particular album, it's meaningless in the grand scheme of things, isn't it? Like, what is important was the process of making it all that truly helped McDermid. And I can appreciate what this album has made me feel, but I feel as though it pales in comparison to the true experience of McDermid's. But I am glad to try to present this on the show. I have no idea how this video is going to turn out. There was a lot I didn't even get to talk about. For example, I didn't get to talk about the wonderful physical packaging for this one. I have time now. So, White Lab Records used to release their albums in faux pas mini vinyls like this, where the album art would just pop right out on a little Polaroid like that. And you'd have the disc like this, with even a strange vinyl design on it. This was one of the reasons why one of the last ones they were able to get by the time I got into White Lab Records, actually. But it happens to be one of the most harrowing ones, which is maybe why people didn't really buy this one. But I'm so glad I was able to get a copy, because it's one of the most fascinating albums I've ever come across. But one that in the grand scheme of dark, disturbing, harrowing album is not one that many people talk about. Weird to throw that all in there, but I figured it was the only other thing to talk about. So yeah, very weird music review. I don't know how many of you are going to be still watching by this point, but if you are, then thank you for sticking with this one. If you have any suggestions for other harrowing, disturbing albums that have affected you, let us know in the comments. We might check them out one day. With that, I do want to thank you for watching this absolute mess of an analysis. I wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.